the professional standards that inform and underpin the apprenticeship programs for social work at Kingston University and perhaps elsewhere too. So I'm going to go through those various standards, try to give a picture of the broader landscape, as it were. Think a little bit about how the relevant standards map against each other, slightly more complex issue, and perhaps make a few suggestions about how you might usefully use the standards in practice, education, and training. Our experience with standards has been interesting. There's a lot of them. They kind of conflict with each other. They support each other. And it's difficult sometimes to get your head around. I'm sure we all have this experience in our lives as social worker educators, as social workers, managers, trainers, students, learners, and apprentices. But, you know, in social work, when we have a problem, we try to do better with it. We try to see, are there ways we can use these things in a positive way? And so that's what we'll attempt to do here today. Well, the first question might be, what standards are we talking about? Cite a little book up there, Professional Practice Education and Social Work, etc., by Beasley and Taplin. I've drawn some of the material from this, but of course you can find out about standards from a wide range of sources. Now, for a long time, the National Occupational Standards was the default setting. There were earlier standards before that, but we need not go back into the last century. And a lot of that was replaced by, first of all, the College of Social Work, which no longer exists, who developed the Professional Capabilities Framework, which then was minded, I suppose, or BASMA took responsibility for that in about 2018, perhaps a little earlier. And then you will know, especially if you're in practice, about the KSS, which is Knowledge and Skill Standards. They started to come in about 2015, kind of mutated a little bit, and we got knowledge, skills, and behaviors from the social work apprenticeship organization, which in fact is the IAT, which covers a whole series of apprenticeships. Let's not get too bogged down in the detail. And then, of course, we have Social Work England Professional Standards, which came in around 2020. We had a new regulator. In contrast to previous regulators, SWEPs do not register students. And then we have the most recent versions of the Skills England apprenticeship standards that used to be the IAT, but they had a rebranding exercise. But in actual fact, since 2022, the social work apprenticeship standards have not changed a great deal. So you think, surely that's enough? Nah, let's add a few more things. Some of you will be familiar with the Practice Educator Professional Standards, or PEPs as they're commonly known. They had a refresh in 2018. Then there's KSS for practice leaders, and then for child and family practice supervisors. Various attempts to develop PQ standards. My guess is that is going to change again with the current government, because we're talking about new frameworks for post-qualifying social workers. There are a whole series of standards for employers of social workers in England. Many of you won't have a great deal of knowledge about that because it's happening at perhaps a higher level in your organization. But it's certainly something that social work organizations all have to report on a regular basis. And we haven't even included things like the BASWA Code of Ethics, which is kind of a bit of a fundamental cornerstone of our practice. And there are a whole series of KSS statements for achieving permanence, social work with autistic adults, and so on and so forth. You can read the slide. So we have a very busy environment, should we say, and what is all of this about then? Is it about improving practice and ensuring consistency? Well, quite often people who, in particular, if you're responsible for standard, will kind of have that as their top line argument, and trying to get consistency across, you know, I suppose close to 100,000 people as registered social workers in the UK. More cynically, perhaps they are about telling us what we should be doing and maybe how we should be thinking. And there is indeed an argument for that. And it may be a kind of gatekeeping process for the profession. So if you set yourself up as a profession with a protected title, you're going to have kind of a framework around that. So maybe it's kind of defensiveness, even, one could argue, on behalf of the profession. Or is it just more neoliberal managerial stuff, importing business thinking and models into social work practice and service? Um, is it a tool, or can they be tools for effective practice? Well, almost certainly. And some of the standards like PCF 6, the most obvious one, is specifically about reflective practice as professionals. And they obviously, these various standards, and I'd say particularly the KSS, but perhaps that'll change, inform job specifications. KSS very much tells you what you should know and be able to do. And so therefore, it kind of lends itself to writing, as it were, job descriptions. Or is it just a whole bunch of boxes that I have to tick in order to be able to do my job? And of course, we haven't included the Ofsted, CQC, and other inspection frameworks, which are kind of aligned but are quite different in some ways. Well, I suppose the truth of the matter is it's all of the above, depending on the time, the context, the purpose, the function of what you're doing. So standards can be used in many different ways, and indeed they are. Now, when we start mapping the standards, the picture gets a little bit more complicated. There already is an excellent tool that maps PCF, KSS, and SWEPs, and it's very pretty too. Very nice looking document. Very comprehensive. There's obviously a lot of work gone into it, and you can very clearly map the standards in various different ways across each other. But they did not include Skills England or IATE as it was then. Apprenticeship standards. And you kind of think, this is interesting. Okay, so apprenticeships relatively new, but we have been around for 5 or 6 years now. And you would have thought that the sector would kind of grasp the nettle. It's not really happened so far. The most recent version of the standards, which I hope are going to be stable and not change, but one never knows, map apparently more closely to the Social Work England professional standards. That's probably a good thing. But really, Social Work England are in a kind of funny position where they, as I said earlier, do not register social workers. So they don't say anything about SWEPs in relation to apprentices. Other than that, they should be familiar with or understand SWEPs by their final year, which is a fairly kind of low bar, really, in a sense. So that rebranding exercise has not resulted in a mapping exercise. So how we use the standards on the program? Well, first of all, delivery of all social work education and training programs is in itself governed by a whole series of standards. A little bit of a whole immerse here, if you see what I mean. And those standards are most strongly set out by Social Work England, but there's also a set from QAA and, of course, internal Kingston course validation processes. So we need not let that lot, as it were, detain us, but nonetheless, there's a background there. So all the taught modules, that is in-class modules, are mapped against the PCF, Social Work England standards, and Skills England. So we've already done that exercise in each individual module and across the course because we're required to do that. As you'll see, and I'll come back to it in a little bit, we start off with the PCF at the start of people's courses, and then we add in kind of a reverse engineer Skills England apprenticeship standards at a later stage, but pretty early on in the course. The PCF has one huge advantage, that there are clear progressions through the levels a person might advance through in their social work career. The other standards do not have that. It's just one block of standards, as it were. So if you're designing, as we are, a learning course, progression becomes a very useful thing to have built into the standard because you can say, well, this is what it should look like in the first, second, third year, and so on and so forth. So the standards map across the different years of the course. It's fairly straightforward, really, even though it might look a little bit complicated here. But for the BA route, that's a 3-year course, level 4 in their first year. And for the postgraduate 2-year course, they, in their first term, work to level 4, the readiness for practice level at BCF, or sometimes called the readiness for direct practice. So that's very straightforward. The standards are, I would guess, in comparison to later standards, particularly qualified social worker, pretty low bar. Apprentices are already working in organizations, so it's something that is not too difficult, really, to be honest, for them to achieve, because they're already doing the majority of what is required to meet the standards when they come and start their courses here. Things step up in year 2. So for the BA, it is the whole of the second year. And for the postgraduate DIPS, it's the second and final terms of their first year. You don't have to retain the detail, but that's at level 5 and at the end of first placement level. So typically that's aligned with the contrasting learning experience, which both groups are doing at level 5, as I say, for the BAs in that first year, and for the postgraduate DIPS in the second half of their first year. Did I say BA first year? I meant BA second year. Apologies. I'm not going to record it again. Well, so in their final year, they're operating at level 6. The levels are slightly more complicated for the postgraduate diploma, but let's not detain ourselves here with that. For the final year, the BA route are working to level 6 throughout the whole year. For the postgraduate DIPS, it is their second year of study and throughout the whole year. And some of you will know that in this final year, for on-the-job learning, they're doing their final practice learning experience, or FPLE. So end of final placement covers that whole year. Just to remind ourselves, here's the levels that we are kind of working through. And of course, this is what we're aiming for, the newly qualified social worker ASYE year. Now, we anticipate that there may be changes in that. There's already signs or indications from government that that will change, but it'll still be the same thing. We're still getting people ready for that next step in their social work professional development journey. This is a little bit about Skills England, because chances are most people, or a lot of people perhaps who are watching this video, are not that familiar with Skills England apprenticeship standards, and why would you be? Apprenticeship standards are all set out in pretty much the same sort of way. There's an occupational summary, a little bit of a story, and it's quite occupational in its take. So you could argue that it doesn't really have the same emphasis on things like social justice and anti-discriminatory practice that perhaps some of other standards and certainly some voices in the profession might like to see. But it is what it is. It then breaks down the standards into occupational duties, and there are 19 of those, and they map against a series of knowledge, skills, and behaviors. It's about between 80 and 90 of these. You think, oh, that's a lot of boxes to tick. Well, if we laboriously tick each box, that might be kind of tedious and not as meaningful as that might be. So you can kind of do that in other ways, but I pretty much guarantee you that all the students, learners, apprentices who finish our courses have gathered evidence against all of these things. We just try to be a little bit clever about how we do it. So we did ask for national guidance about mapping, as I've mentioned earlier. And we asked BASWA, we asked other education providers, and we didn't really make much progress on that. Nobody seems to want to take too much responsibility for it, which is kind of interesting. I mean, apprenticeships have been around for quite a few years now, and I think they're kind of a growth area, at least in part because of funding arrangements and perhaps employers wanting to get some value out of the apprenticeship levy, and also it is an affordable route for many apprentices to gain their qualification that might not otherwise be possible for them. We could argue about that. But when in doubt, do it yourself. Now, of course, when you do it yourself, you can get things wrong, as my little illustration here might indicate. But we've had a pretty robust go at it. We're still kind of developing and looking at it. But essentially, what we created is a spreadsheet that acts as a translator between the PCF and the Skills England's apprenticeship standards. Now, there's various different tabs on the spreadsheet, and students all have access to it. But tab 3 basically is likely to be the most used to apprentices, and they do use it on a regular basis. It's probably not something they look forward to with great joy, but it helps them complete the task and kind of makes it a little easier instead of kind of going through kind of a long list of 85 things to be ticked off. And this way it's possible to comprehensively ensure that you have met all the standards without treating it, I suppose, as a logarithmic table. So we're still working on this, kind of considering at the moment using AI to perhaps have another go, experiment a little bit to see if there are better ways of mapping the standards. But this is what we are using at the present time. So in general, how do we use professional standards? Well, there's some kind of realism and pragmatism involved in this. If you cover the PCF, you will cover Skills England. And the final year, Social Work England, they want us to make sure that every student that comes out and into the workplace, into the ASY programs and so on, has an understanding of Social Work England professional standards, and we have ways of doing that. So we're not actually asking them to gather evidence against SWEPs, but they do have to have an understanding because, of course, that's what they're going to be working to when they are qualified. I suppose it's really quite important also to make sure that we have a comprehensive and wide-ranging notion of what social workers are expected to know, do, and maybe critically how to behave. So there's some important lessons here about, well, what do we mean by professionalism then, for example, so on and so forth. Obviously, we use standards to identify strengths and areas for development, always starting off with the strengths. Strengths are a better, more solid and reliable foundation to build on than operating on a deficit model where we consider what you don't know and can't do at the start, if you see what it means. So that would be part of our general ethos in the program anyway. And of course, because we are working in modern, postmodern organizations, understanding professional standards, managing information systems and standards and various things of that nature is just part of what we have to do and what we have to know and understand. You have to be able to operate in that environment. So of itself, it's kind of important to acquire skills in doing that. Now, it turns out, quite funnily, that there is an inspectorate for the inspectorates. There is a body that oversees the bodies who create standards in all sorts of different professions across the whole country. And interestingly enough, a little while ago, Social Work England were kind of given their own areas for development and did not meet two of the standards. They didn't meet standard 3 because a lack of EDI, quality, diversity and inclusion data, they held on as registrants. It is social work profession. No. And standard 17 because it took too long to make decisions about interim orders. I think, if memory serves, that was about fitness to practice and various other processes that the regulator is involved in. Nobody's perfect, eh? But you can see the complexity of the landscape perhaps in that, and that might give us cause for pause and reflection, because as learners, we can also examine these things critically. Now, the reflective elements, obviously, in the wider profession, there was, until relatively recently, I'm only saying because Hilary Lawson's work here is 10 years old and thereabouts now. There was strong support for the PCF. And of course, you'll notice the dates. Now, this comes out around the same time as other standards, KSSs, et cetera, are being produced. But what professionals said was that PCF prompts personal and professional development. Okay, I suppose in a sense that might be a given, but the personal bit there is an interesting addition, is it not? Encourages professional autonomy. We're not automatons. Social work is art and science, I think, and the skills of the practitioner are kind of perhaps unique in that we are arguably a values-based profession. And of course, you can track your own professional development using things. It makes it easier perhaps to identify areas where you kind of might do better or have something to learn. And in a kind of broader context, there's something about shaping practice. Critically, perhaps it's meaningful to practitioners. We can understand it, speaks to us, partly because it was developed by the profession, for the profession, perhaps. Maybe a dinosaur in the PCF. It's not long for the world. Some people argue that too, but I think it has many strengths. And one of them is that it has a strong and shared value base. So we can kind of reflect in a broader sense, not just about our practice or our work about, we can look at the world of standards and why they are like they are. During the pandemic, a social work academic created this little map, and it was a social work magazine, about 5 issues published. And of course, a lot of people had a lot of time to spend indoors, and perhaps were kind of mapping things in a way that they might not have otherwise. And this is obviously mainly from children's social care, and they were mapping the relationships, in particular between frontline and other organizations, particular individuals and funders, kind of various kind of stakeholders, as you might call them. And you will notice that Josh McAllister is there in the front, quite interesting, perhaps a little prescient, as Josh now has a ministerial position. You will also notice that there are some funders here, BCG, Boston Consulting Group, who are kind of funding Frontline from the earliest stages. We have Credit Suisse. We have various other training, education providers. You can see Isabel Trowler is up there, Rachel D'Souza, various kind of big hitters in the world out there, but all very much in a kind of a new kind of postmodern sort of kind of setting with lots of people involved there who are how would I say, quasi business organizations. Some of them will be community interest companies and things of that nature. But it shows a shift in the landscape, whatever way you think about it. There may be philosophy underpinning this, a way of thinking about funding and developing social work practice that is, shall we say, interesting. We could spend a long time talking about these things, but I suppose it just tells us, if nothing else, that we are living in a changing landscape, that social work practice is not just about standards, it's also about the money. So I was trying to bring PCF 6 and 8 together there, perhaps, and 1. But the professional standards are here to stay. I hope that this has given you sufficient understanding about how we use the PCF and the Skills England apprenticeship standards in particular. I expect that these things will continue to develop over time, and maybe we'll have to do this video again when we have a new update. That would not be in the least bit surprising. The only constant, as they say, is change. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you have a good day. And it just remains for me to say bye.